Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, the cozy corner of the internet where we dive into the depths of fascinating literature with the warmth of a coffee chat. Today, you've chosen to explore The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, and I must commend you for your choice. In a world that tempts us with endless streams of scrolling and binge-worthy shows, your decision to immerse yourself in this profound work speaks volumes about your desire to learn and connect on a deeper level. This book is not just any exploration of religion and spirituality. It's a groundbreaking examination of human consciousness and belief, regarded as one of the most insightful works in the psychology of religion. William James, a name that resonates with intellectual curiosity and philosophical inquiry, offers us a tapestry of real human experiences with the divine. This isn't just about religious doctrine. It's about understanding the vast spectrum of human emotions and spiritual awakenings. Varieties of Religious Experience has been hailed by many, including thinkers like Carl Jung, who recommended it as essential reading, and it has influenced countless others in both religious and secular realms. William James, a philosopher and psychologist, was driven by his quest to understand the human psyche. His personal struggles with health and existential questions fueled his journey into the world of religious experience, making this work both deeply personal and universally relevant. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. A profound exploration of human spirituality. William James, a pioneering psychologist and philosopher, was fueled by a personal quest to understand the depths of human consciousness and spirituality, driven by his own existential inquiries and health challenges. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone at a coffee shop, and they lean forward with that slightly mischievous look people get when they're about to challenge everything you think you know. That's essentially what William James does right from the opening of his groundbreaking work on religious experience. He starts with what might seem like a strange question for a book about spirituality. What if the most profound religious insights in human history came from people who were, well, a little neurologically different? Now, before you start thinking this sounds like some kind of attack on faith, hold on. James isn't trying to debunk religion by pointing to brain chemistry. He's doing something far more interesting and, frankly, more revolutionary. He's asking us to consider whether the source of an experience matters as much as its fruits. Think about this for a moment. If someone discovers a beautiful piece of music while they're in an altered state of consciousness, does that make the music less beautiful? If a scientist has their greatest breakthrough during a fever dream, does that invalidate their discovery? James opens this first lecture by acknowledging the elephant in the room that every serious student of religion eventually encounters. Throughout history, many of the most influential religious figures, the ones who have shaped entire civilizations with their spiritual insights, have exhibited what we might today recognize as neurological peculiarities. St. Paul had his dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus, complete with temporary blindness and voices from heaven. Saint Teresa of Avila experienced ecstatic visions that left her physically transformed. George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, had episodes where he would tremble uncontrollably, giving his followers their nickname of Quakers. In James's time, and even more so today, we have sophisticated ways of understanding the brain. We know about temporal lobe epilepsy. We understand how certain neurochemical imbalances can produce vivid hallucinations, and we can map exactly which parts of the brain light up during what people describe as mystical experiences. The question James poses is deceptively simple but profoundly challenging. So what? He introduces us to what philosophers call the genetic fallacy. though he doesn't use that exact term. This is the mistake of thinking that if you can explain where something comes from, you've somehow explained away its value or truth. It's like saying that because we know Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is just vibrations in the air created by specific arrangements of wood, metal, and string, it's somehow less magnificent. Or arguing that because we understand the neurochemistry of love, romantic feelings are just illusions we shouldn't take seriously. James tells us about a conversation he had with a friend who was going through what we might today call a severe depressive episode. This friend described feeling as though a thick, gray curtain had fallen between him and the world, making everything seem flat, meaningless, and dead. But here's the fascinating part. During this period of what the friend considered mental illness, he also reported having incredibly clear insights into the nature of existence, the futility of most human pursuits, and what he saw as the fundamental absurdity of taking our daily concerns too seriously. Now, was this depression talking, or was this genuine wisdom? James suggests that maybe it's both, and maybe that's okay. Perhaps our altered states, whether caused by illness, meditation, drugs, or extreme circumstances, don't disqualify our insights but rather give us access to aspects of reality that our normal, everyday consciousness filters out. Think about how this applies to your own life. Have you ever noticed that some of your most profound realizations come at unexpected moments? Maybe during a fever when your normal mental defenses are down, or in that strange twilight state between sleeping and waking, or during times of intense stress when your usual way of seeing the world gets shaken up. James is suggesting that these aren't accidents or mistakes to be dismissed, but potentially valuable windows into aspects of existence that our ordinary consciousness, with all its practical concerns and social conditioning, usually keeps locked away. He draws our attention to the fact that what we consider normal consciousness is really just one particular way of organizing our experience of reality. It's the mode that evolution has equipped us with because it's useful for survival, for navigating social relationships, for getting things done in the physical world. But usefulness isn't the same thing as completeness or ultimate truth. A GPS is incredibly useful for getting from point A to point B, but it doesn't give you the full experience of the landscape you're traveling through. James makes a brilliant observation about the relationship between genius and what his era called degeneracy. He notes that many of history's greatest contributors to art, science, and spiritual understanding have been people who existed somewhat outside the bounds of what their societies considered normal mental functioning. This isn't to romanticize mental illness or suggest that suffering is necessary for insight. Rather, it's to recognize that the human brain's capacity for different modes of experience might be a feature, not a bug. Consider how this perspective might change the way we think about consciousness itself. Instead of seeing altered states as deviations from a norm, we might see them as different instruments in an orchestra, each capable of detecting and expressing different aspects of the symphony of existence. The mystic's ecstasy, the artist's inspiration, the scientist's sudden breakthrough, the ordinary person's moment of unexpected clarity during a crisis, all might be valid ways of tuning into frequencies of reality that our everyday awareness typically can't pick up. James is setting up what will become the central theme of his entire investigation, that we should judge religious experiences not by their neurological origins, but by their practical consequences in people's lives. Do they make people more compassionate, more courageous, more capable of love? Do they provide genuine guidance for living? Do they offer insights that prove valuable when tested against the complexities of human existence? These, he suggests, are the questions that matter. As we prepare to dive deeper into the varieties of religious experience that James will catalog and analyze, he's given us a crucial framework for understanding what we're about to encounter. We're not going to be asking whether these experiences are real in some objective sense, or whether they can be reduced to brain chemistry. Instead, we're going to be asking the much more interesting and practical question: what can these experiences teach us about the full range of human possibility and the many different ways consciousness can engage with the mystery of existence? Picture this. You're at a dinner party and someone mentions they've had a profound spiritual experience. Immediately, the room divides. Some people lean in with genuine curiosity, others roll their eyes, and a few quietly change the subject. This exact scenario captures why William James, in his second lecture, knew he had to be incredibly careful about defining what he meant by religious experience. It's like trying to capture lightning in a bottle, while everyone's arguing about whether lightning even exists. James opens this lecture with the wisdom of someone who's clearly been in those awkward dinner party conversations. He understands that the moment you start talking about religion, you're stepping into a minefield of personal beliefs, cultural conditioning, and deeply held convictions. So instead of charging ahead blindly, he does something brilliant. He draws boundaries. Think of it like a master chef explaining exactly which ingredients he'll use and which ones he'll leave out of his signature dish. Now here's where James shows his genius. Rather than trying to tackle all of religion, which would be like trying to drink the ocean through a straw, he makes a strategic decision. He's going to focus exclusively on personal religious experience, not institutional religion. This is huge. He's essentially saying, I'm not interested in what the church, mosque, or temple tells you to believe. I want to know what happens when you, as an individual, encounter something you consider divine or transcendent. Imagine the difference between reading about chocolate and actually tasting it. James is choosing to study the tasting, not the recipe books. He wants to understand what happens in that moment when someone feels they've touched something beyond themselves, whether it's during prayer, meditation, a walk in nature, or even in the midst of personal crisis. This focus on first-hand experience rather than second-hand doctrine was revolutionary for his time and remains refreshingly honest today. But James doesn't stop there. He makes another crucial distinction that's worth pondering over your morning coffee. He separates what he calls first-hand religious experience from second-hand religious experience. First-hand experience is when you personally feel that connection to the divine, whatever form it takes. Second-hand experience is when you accept religious truths because your community, family, or religious leaders have told you they're true. It's the difference between discovering a hidden trail yourself and following someone else's map to it. Think about this in modern terms. How many of our beliefs about anything, not just religion, are truly our own discoveries versus things we've inherited or absorbed from our culture? James is essentially asking us to distinguish between what we know because we've experienced it and what we believe because we've been told it's true. This isn't to diminish second-hand religious experience, mind you. James acknowledges that most religious people operate primarily from this inherited faith, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for his study, he wants to examine the raw, unfiltered moments when individuals feel they've encountered the sacred directly. Here's where the lecture gets really interesting. James introduces what we might call his laboratory conditions for studying religious experience. He's not going to focus on the healthy-minded, well-adjusted religious person who attends services regularly and finds comfort in traditional beliefs. Instead, he's drawn to what he calls the sick soul, the person who has wrestled with doubt, despair, and spiritual crisis before emerging with a transformed understanding of life. Why this focus on spiritual struggle? James argues that it's in these intense, often painful experiences that we see religious consciousness at its most pure and powerful. It's like how we often don't appreciate our health until we've been seriously ill, or how we don't fully value relationships until we've experienced loss. The person who has been through spiritual darkness and emerged into light has something to teach us about the nature of religious experience that the perpetually cheerful believer might not. Consider someone today who loses their faith after a personal tragedy, then gradually rebuilds a completely different but deeply meaningful spiritual life. Or think about someone who hits rock bottom with addiction and finds recovery through a spiritual awakening. These dramatic transformations, James suggests, reveal something essential about human nature and our capacity for spiritual growth that we might miss if we only studied conventional religious practice. James also makes a fascinating point about the relationship between religion and psychology. He's not trying to explain away religious experience by reducing it to mere psychology. Instead, he's suggesting that understanding the psychological mechanisms of religious experience might actually help us appreciate its significance. It's like studying how the brain processes music doesn't diminish the beauty of a symphony. It might actually enhance our wonder at how humans can be moved to tears by organized sound waves. This approach was radical for 1902 and remains thought-provoking today. In our age of neuroscience and brain imaging, we can literally watch what happens in someone's brain during meditation or prayer. Does this scientific understanding diminish the spiritual significance of these experiences? James would say absolutely not. Understanding the how doesn't negate the why or the what. As James wraps up this foundational lecture, he's essentially handed us a roadmap for the journey ahead. We're going to explore the most intense, transformative, and personally significant religious experiences humans can have. We're going to take these experiences seriously without necessarily accepting any particular theological explanation for them. And we're going to approach them with both scientific rigor and genuine respect for their profound impact on human lives. This sets us up perfectly for the deep dive that's coming. James has cleared the deck, defined his terms, and prepared us to encounter some of the most remarkable stories of human spiritual transformation ever documented. It's going to be quite a ride. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, and someone asks you to prove that love exists. Not the chemical reactions in your brain, not the behavioral patterns you can observe, but love itself. You'd probably struggle, wouldn't you? Yet most of us would stake our lives on love being absolutely real. This is exactly where William James takes us in his third lecture on religious experience, and it's a journey that might just change how you think about reality itself. James opens this exploration with a fascinating observation that still rings true today. He argues that human beings are naturally wired to believe in what he calls the unseen order, realities that exist beyond what our five senses can detect. Now, before you start thinking this sounds like mystical nonsense, consider your own life for a moment. Think about the things that matter most to you: justice, beauty, meaning, purpose. Can you touch justice? Can you measure meaning with a ruler? Yet these unseen realities often drive our most important decisions. What James discovered through his research was that people who have profound religious experiences aren't just imagining things or engaging in wishful thinking. They're tapping into something that feels more real to them than the physical world around them. He shares the story of a man who described feeling an invisible presence so powerfully that it changed his entire life direction. The man couldn't see this presence, couldn't prove it existed, but the psychological impact was undeniable and lasting. James asks us to consider, if something has real effects in the real world, doesn't that make it real in the most important sense? Here's where James gets really interesting, and where his insights feel incredibly modern. He suggests that our rational, scientific minds represent only one way of knowing reality. Think about how you know your best friend loves you. Sure, you might point to their actions, their words, their consistency over time. But there's also something deeper, isn't there? Some intuitive knowing that goes beyond evidence. James argues that religious consciousness operates in this same realm of direct, intuitive knowing. The psychological impact of believing in unseen realities is where James really hits his stride. He documents case after case of people whose lives were transformed not by visible miracles or dramatic external events, but by an inner conviction that they were connected to something greater than themselves. A woman struggling with depression suddenly feels held by an invisible love. A man facing a moral crisis senses a guiding presence that helps him choose the right path. These aren't people James dismisses as delusional. They're often highly intelligent, successful individuals whose lives became measurably better after these experiences. Now think about this in terms of our modern world. We live in an age that prizes scientific materialism, where many people feel that if something can't be measured in a laboratory, it doesn't really exist. Yet we're also living through what many call a crisis of meaning. Depression and anxiety rates are skyrocketing, despite our unprecedented material prosperity. Could there be a connection? James would argue that when we cut ourselves off from the unseen dimensions of reality, from meaning, purpose, transcendence, we impoverish our psychological lives in ways that no amount of visible success can compensate for. James introduces us to what he calls the noetic quality of religious experiences. This is a fancy way of saying that these experiences feel like ways of knowing, not just ways of feeling. The person who senses God's presence doesn't just feel comforted, they feel like they've learned something true about the nature of reality. It's similar to how you might suddenly understand a complex problem you've been wrestling with. The solution doesn't come through logical reasoning, but through a kind of direct insight that feels absolutely certain. What's particularly fascinating is how James connects this to everyday psychology. He points out that all of us live by faith in unseen realities, whether we realize it or not. When you trust that the sun will rise tomorrow, that's faith in an unseen future. When you believe that treating others kindly matters, that's faith in invisible moral realities. Religious experience, James suggests, is simply a more intense and focused version of this universal human tendency. The practical implications of James's insights extend far beyond religion. Consider how believing in unseen realities shapes everything from relationships to career choices. The entrepreneur who starts a business is betting on an unseen future market. The parent who sacrifices for their child's education is investing in invisible potential. The activist fighting for social justice is working toward an unseen better world. In each case, belief in something not yet visible drives real-world action. James also explores how different personalities relate to the unseen differently. Some people are naturally more receptive to these experiences, while others are more skeptical. Neither approach is right or wrong. They're different ways of engaging with reality. The key insight is that both the mystical and the rational perspectives capture something important about human experience. As we wrap up this exploration of the unseen, James leaves us with a profound challenge. He suggests that the question isn't whether unseen realities exist in some objective sense. The question is whether recognizing and cultivating our relationship with them makes us more fully human. The evidence he presents suggests that it does. People who maintain some connection to transcendent realities tend to be more resilient, more compassionate, more capable of finding meaning in difficulty. This brings us to a crucial transition point in James's larger argument. Having established that unseen realities have genuine psychological power, he's now ready to explore the specific characteristics that make some religious experiences more valuable than others. Because not all encounters with the invisible are created equal, and learning to distinguish between life-giving and life-diminishing spiritual experiences becomes essential for anyone seeking to live wisely. The reality of the unseen, as James presents it, isn't about proving the existence of God or validating any particular religious doctrine. It's about recognizing that human consciousness naturally reaches toward meanings and purposes that transcend the material world, and that honoring this reach might be essential for psychological health and human flourishing. So we've been exploring this fascinating landscape of religious experience with William James, and now we find ourselves at what might be one of the most refreshing stops on our journey. Picture yourself walking through a garden after a long, gray winter, and suddenly you're surrounded by blooming flowers, warm sunshine, and the kind of optimism that makes you believe everything is going to work out just fine. That's essentially what James calls the religion of healthy-mindedness. And honestly, after diving into some of the heavier psychological territory we've covered, This feels like taking a deep breath of fresh air. Now, think about this for a moment. You probably know someone who seems to have this almost supernatural ability to see the bright side of everything. Maybe it's that friend who responds to every setback with, "Everything happens for a reason," or "This is just redirecting me towards something better." James wasn't just observing this phenomenon casually over his morning coffee. He was genuinely fascinated by people who seemed to have discovered a way to live that was fundamentally oriented toward joy, optimism, and what he called healthy-mindedness. But here's where it gets really interesting. James isn't talking about simple positive thinking or the kind of surface-level optimism you might find in a motivational poster. He's describing something much deeper, something that seems to transform people's entire relationship with existence itself. These healthy-minded religious folks don't just think positive thoughts. They appear to inhabit a completely different universe, one where goodness is the fundamental reality, and everything else is either illusion or temporary interference. Take, for example, the story James tells about a woman who described her spiritual awakening as suddenly realizing that God's love was like sunshine that had always been shining, and she had simply been living in a house with all the curtains drawn. One day, she said, she just opened the curtains and discovered this incredible light had been there all along. Now, whether you're religious or not, there's something profoundly moving about that image, isn't there? The idea that perhaps our suffering and anxiety come not from the absence of something good, but from our failure to perceive the goodness that's already present. James observed that healthy-minded religion tends to operate on what we might call a once-born principle. Unlike the dramatic conversion experiences we often hear about, where someone hits rock bottom and then finds salvation, healthy-minded believers seem to grow naturally into their faith like a plant growing toward sunlight. They don't wrestle with dark nights of the soul or agonize over sin and redemption. Instead, they seem to have this intuitive sense that the universe is fundamentally benevolent, and that aligning themselves with this benevolence is the most natural thing in the world. Think about how radical this actually is in our current cultural moment. We live in an age of anxiety, don't we? We're constantly bombarded with news of catastrophes, reminded of our mortality, encouraged to worry about everything from our carbon footprint to our retirement savings. Yet here James is describing people who seem to have found a way to live that's immune to this kind of existential dread. They've discovered what he calls the once-born way of being religious, where faith feels less like a desperate lifeline and more like coming home. But James, being the careful psychologist he was, doesn't just celebrate this phenomenon without examining it critically. He recognizes that healthy-mindedness can sometimes shade into what we might call spiritual bypassing. You know those people who respond to every genuine problem with "just think positive" or "you're manifesting negative energy." James saw this tendency too. He noticed that some forms of healthy-minded religion could become a way of avoiding, rather than engaging with life's genuine difficulties. The fascinating thing is how relevant this observation feels today. Think about our modern wellness culture, with its emphasis on gratitude practices, positive affirmations, and the law of attraction. In many ways, we're seeing a secular version of exactly what James was describing over a century ago. People are hungry for this healthy-minded approach to life, this sense that we can choose our reality through the quality of our thoughts and beliefs. James tells us about the New Thought movement of his era, which taught that illness, poverty, and unhappiness were essentially errors in thinking that could be corrected through proper mental alignment. Sound familiar? It's remarkably similar to what we see in contemporary movements that promise we can manifest our dreams through visualization and positive thinking. The core insight remains the same. Our inner state profoundly shapes our outer experience of reality. What makes James's analysis so valuable is that he neither dismisses healthy-mindedness as naive nor accepts it uncritically as the ultimate truth. Instead, He recognizes it as one legitimate way of being religious, one that clearly works for certain temperaments and life situations. He observed that healthy-minded people often seem to possess a kind of spiritual immunity to depression and despair. They've found what he calls the elimination of the negative and the accentuation of the positive. But here's what I find most compelling about James's treatment of this subject. He recognizes that healthy-mindedness isn't just about individual psychological well-being. It's about a fundamental orientation toward existence that sees goodness as primary and evil as secondary. This isn't just therapeutic, it's philosophical. It's a way of answering the deepest questions about what kind of universe we live in and what our role in it might be. As we prepare to move deeper into James's exploration of religious experience, it's worth carrying this insight with us. The religion of healthy-mindedness offers us a glimpse of what human consciousness might look like when it's oriented primarily toward joy, gratitude, and trust in the fundamental goodness of existence. Whether or not this resonates with your own temperament or life experience, it represents one of the remarkable varieties of human religious consciousness that James wants us to understand and appreciate. And that appreciation, that willingness to see the world through different spiritual eyes, is exactly what makes this journey through religious experience so enriching and transformative. Picture this. You're sitting with a friend who's going through one of those seasons where everything feels heavy, where the world seems painted in shades of gray, and they look at you with genuine confusion and ask, "How do some people seem so naturally happy? What's wrong with me?" This is exactly the territory William James ventures into in his 5th lecture on the varieties of religious experience, and it's a conversation that feels as relevant today as it did over a century ago. James calls this state the sick soul, but before you recoil at that phrase, understand that he's not being dismissive or cruel. He's actually doing something quite revolutionary for his time, and frankly, for ours too. He's saying that this darker, more melancholic way of experiencing life isn't a defect to be fixed or a weakness to be ashamed of. Instead, it might be a different, equally valid path to understanding the deepest truths about existence, and ultimately, to finding genuine spiritual transformation. Now, think about this for a moment. We live in a culture obsessed with positivity, with life hacks and gratitude journals and the relentless pursuit of happiness. Social media feeds us an endless stream of people who seem to have figured it all out, who wake up grateful and go to bed fulfilled. But what about those of us who look at a beautiful sunset and feel an inexplicable sadness? What about those who achieve success and still feel empty? James is telling us that these people, the ones he calls sick souls, might actually be seeing something the naturally cheerful are missing. James contrasts 2 fundamental types of religious personalities. First, there are the healthy-minded folks, the ones who seem to glide through life with an innate sense that everything will work out fine. These are the people who can genuinely say every cloud has a silver lining and mean it. They're drawn to religions that emphasize joy, abundance, and the inherent goodness of creation. Think of someone who finds God in every flower, who sees setbacks as opportunities, who genuinely believes that focusing on the positive is both a moral duty and a practical strategy for living. But then there are the sick souls, and here's where James gets really interesting. These are the people who can't simply think their way into happiness, who find the healthy-minded approach not just ineffective but almost insulting. They look at the world and see suffering that can't be explained away, injustice that can't be rationalized, and a kind of existential weight that positive thinking simply cannot lift. For them, the healthy-minded approach feels like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. James shares the story of a French philosopher who experienced what we might now recognize as severe depression or anxiety. This man described lying in bed, overwhelmed by a sense of the fragility of everything he held dear. He imagined losing his health, his loved ones, his mental faculties, and realized that all the things he typically relied on for happiness were ultimately temporary and uncertain. It wasn't that anything bad had actually happened to him. But he suddenly saw through what he felt was the illusion of security that most people live with. Now you might be thinking, this sounds like depression, and we have medication for that now. And you'd be partly right. But James is making a deeper point. He's suggesting that sometimes what we call depression or melancholy might actually be a more honest assessment of the human condition. The sick soul sees the temporary nature of all earthly happiness, the inevitability of loss, the reality of suffering that touches every life. They can't simply choose to focus on the positive, because they've seen too clearly that the positive is built on shifting sand. But here's the fascinating twist. James argues that this very darkness, this inability to find satisfaction in surface-level solutions, often leads to the most profound religious experiences. The sick soul, having exhausted all the conventional sources of meaning and happiness, becomes genuinely open to transformation that goes beyond mere mood improvement. They're not looking for a spiritual pick-me-up. They're looking for something that can remain true even in the face of life's most brutal realities. Think about some of the most influential spiritual figures in history. The Buddha began his spiritual journey when he encountered old age, sickness, and death for the first time, and realized that no amount of palace luxury could protect him from these fundamental aspects of human existence. St. Augustine wrote his Confessions from a place of deep personal struggle with meaning and morality. Even in more recent times, figures like Mother Teresa experienced what she called the dark night of the soul, periods of spiritual dryness and doubt that lasted for decades. James suggests that the sick soul's path to religious experience often involves what he calls the twice-born process. Unlike the healthy-minded, who feel naturally connected to the divine, the sick soul must undergo a kind of death and rebirth. They must fully acknowledge the inadequacy of their natural state before they can be genuinely transformed by something beyond themselves. This resonates powerfully with our contemporary understanding of post-traumatic growth, the psychological phenomenon where people who face significant challenges often develop a deeper appreciation for life, stronger relationships, and a more robust sense of meaning than they had before their difficulties. The sick soul, in James's framework, is someone who faces the trauma of existence itself, and through that confrontation, becomes available for genuine spiritual transformation. What makes this particularly relevant today is how it speaks to anyone who has felt alienated by toxic positivity or spiritual bypassing. If you've ever been told to, just think positive, when you're wrestling with genuine existential questions, or if you felt like there's something wrong with you because meditation retreats and self-help books leave you feeling more empty than fulfilled, James is offering you a different framework. He's saying that your inability to be satisfied with easy answers might not be a bug in your spiritual operating system. It might be a feature. The sick soul's journey reminds us that sometimes the most authentic spiritual path requires us to go through the darkness rather than around it, to fully acknowledge what the poet Rilke called the difficult, before we can discover what lies beyond our natural capacity for happiness. In a world that often treats spiritual seeking like a wellness trend, James reminds us that the deepest transformations often begin not with a smile, but with an honest recognition of our need for something more substantial than positive thinking can provide. Picture this: you're sitting with a friend who's going through a rough patch and they tell you something like, "I feel like I'm two different people. Part of me wants to be better, to change, but another part of me keeps pulling me back to the same old patterns." Sound familiar? Well, grab your coffee a little tighter, because William James is about to take us deep into one of the most universally human experiences, the divided self. In this 6th lecture of the Varieties of Religious Experience, James isn't just giving us abstract philosophy. He's holding up a mirror to something we've all felt at one time or another, that sense of being at war with ourselves. You know that feeling when you want to eat healthy but find yourself reaching for another slice of pizza? Or when you promise yourself you'll be more patient with your kids, then find yourself snapping at them over spilled cereal. James would say you're experiencing what he calls the divided self. And here's the fascinating part. He argues that this internal conflict is actually the starting point for some of the most profound spiritual transformations in human history. Now think about this for a moment. James isn't talking about people who are mentally ill or somehow broken. He's talking about perfectly normal individuals who simply feel this deep sense of incompleteness, this nagging awareness that they're not living up to their own ideals. He describes it as being sick souls, not because they're diseased, but because they're acutely aware of the gap between who they are and who they want to be. It's like having spiritual growing pains. James tells us about a young man who wrote to him, describing how he felt split between his higher and lower nature. One moment he'd feel connected to something greater, inspired to live with purpose and meaning. The next moment he'd find himself caught up in petty concerns, selfish thoughts, or destructive habits. Does this sound like anyone you know? Maybe someone you see in the mirror every morning? Here's where James gets really interesting. He argues that this divided state isn't a bug in the human system, it's a feature. It's the tension that creates the possibility for transformation. Think of it like a rubber band. When there's no tension, nothing happens. But stretch that rubber band, create some tension, and suddenly you have potential energy. The divided self is like that stretched rubber band, uncomfortable, yes, but full of potential for change. James introduces us to people like John Bunyan, the author of Pilgrim's Progress, who went through years of spiritual torment before experiencing what he called his conversion. Bunyan described feeling like he was literally being pulled apart by conflicting forces within himself. He'd have moments of hope followed by crushing despair, periods of faith interrupted by overwhelming doubt. But here's the crucial insight James offers. It was precisely this period of division and struggle that prepared Bunyan for his eventual spiritual breakthrough. Now you might be thinking, that's all well and good for 17th century religious figures, but what does this mean for me? Well, consider this modern parallel. How many people do you know who have gone through what we might call a quarter-life crisis, or a midlife crisis? That sense of being stuck between who they were and who they want to become. James would say these people are experiencing their own version of the divided self, and they're standing at the threshold of potential transformation. The process James describes isn't just about religious conversion in the traditional sense. He's talking about any moment when a person moves from feeling fragmented and conflicted to feeling whole and unified. It could be someone overcoming addiction, finding their life's purpose, healing from trauma, or simply learning to accept themselves fully. The common thread is this movement from division to unity, from conflict to peace. James explains that this unification process often happens in what feels like a sudden moment, what he calls the conversion experience. But he's careful to point out that this sudden transformation is usually the result of long periods of unconscious preparation. It's like how a seed might seem to sprout overnight, but it's actually been slowly growing roots in the darkness for weeks. The dramatic moment of breakthrough is just when the growth finally becomes visible above ground. Think about the last time you had a major realization about yourself or your life. Maybe it hit you like a bolt of lightning while you were washing dishes or driving to work. But if you really examine it, you'll probably realize that insight had been building up inside you for months or even years. That's exactly what James is describing. The mysterious process by which our unconscious mind works on our problems and conflicts until suddenly everything clicks into place. What makes James's analysis so compelling is that he doesn't dismiss these experiences as mere psychology or reduce them to brain chemistry. He takes seriously the possibility that something genuinely transformative is happening, that people really can become fundamentally different, more integrated versions of themselves. At the same time, he's not asking us to accept any particular religious doctrine. He's simply observing that human beings have this remarkable capacity for self-transformation, especially when they're willing to sit with their contradictions rather than running away from them. The practical wisdom here is profound. Instead of seeing our inner conflicts as problems to be solved immediately, James suggests we might view them as necessary stages in our development. That restlessness you feel, that sense that something needs to change in your life, these aren't signs that you're doing something wrong. They might be signs that you're ready to grow into a more complete version of yourself. As we move forward in our exploration of religious experience, James has shown us that the path to spiritual wholeness often begins with honest acknowledgement of our dividedness. It's only when we stop pretending we have it all together that we create space for genuine transformation. And sometimes, the very conflicts that make us most uncomfortable are the ones pointing us toward our next level of growth. Picture yourself sitting across from William James in a cozy cafe, steam rising from your coffee cups, as he leans forward with that characteristic twinkle in his eye and says, "You know, I've been thinking about something fascinating. What happens when a person's entire world suddenly flips upside down?" This is exactly where we find ourselves in Lecture 7 of the Varieties of Religious Experience, diving deep into one of the most mysterious and transformative aspects of human psychology, religious conversion. Now, think about this for a moment. Have you ever had one of those experiences where everything just clicked into place? Maybe it was falling in love, or finally understanding a difficult concept, or having a breakthrough moment in therapy. That sudden shift from confusion to clarity, from struggle to peace, from despair to hope. James tells us that religious conversion is essentially this experience amplified and directed toward the divine. It's like someone has been fumbling around in a dark room for years, bumping into furniture, stubbing their toes, and then suddenly someone flips on the light switch. Everything that was there before is still there, but now it's illuminated, organized, meaningful. James begins by making a crucial distinction that still resonates powerfully today. He separates conversion into two main types, the gradual and the sudden. The gradual type is like watching a sunrise, where the darkness slowly gives way to light in imperceptible degrees until you realize the whole landscape has been transformed. Think of someone who grows up in a religious household, gradually deepening their faith through years of study, prayer, and community involvement. There's no dramatic moment, no lightning bolt, just a steady evolution of understanding and commitment. But it's the sudden conversions that really capture our imagination, isn't it? These are the Damascus Road experiences, named after the Apostle Paul's dramatic encounter with the divine that literally knocked him off his horse and changed him from Christianity's greatest persecutor to its most passionate advocate. James shares story after story of people whose lives were completely transformed in a matter of moments or hours. One particularly striking account involves a man who described feeling as though he was drowning in despair, when suddenly he felt lifted up by invisible hands and filled with an overwhelming sense of love and forgiveness. What's fascinating is how James approaches these experiences not as a skeptic trying to debunk them, nor as a believer trying to validate them, but as a psychologist genuinely curious about the mechanics of human transformation. He asks the kinds of questions we might ask today. What's actually happening in the brain during these moments? Are there common patterns or triggers? And perhaps most importantly, what are the lasting effects on people's lives? Here's where James becomes almost prophetic in his insights. He recognizes that conversion often involves what he calls the sick soul finding healing. These aren't necessarily people who are mentally ill in any clinical sense, but rather individuals who have become acutely aware of life's fundamental problems, contradictions, and sufferings. They're the people who lie awake at 3 in the morning wondering about the meaning of existence, who feel disconnected from themselves and others, who carry a deep sense that something essential is missing from their lives. Now, doesn't this sound remarkably familiar in our current age of anxiety, depression, and existential crisis? James was writing over a century ago, but he might as well be describing the modern epidemic of what we now call mental health struggles. The difference is that, in his era, people often found their healing through religious awakening, while today we might turn to therapy, medication, or self-help books. But the underlying human need for transformation and meaning remains exactly the same. One of James's most brilliant observations is about what he calls the divided self becoming unified. Imagine someone whose inner life is like a committee where everyone is arguing. Part of them wants to be good, another part is drawn to destructive behaviors. Part of them believes in love and hope, another part is cynical and despairing. Part of them wants to connect with others, another part wants to hide away. The conversion experience, according to James, is like suddenly having a strong chairperson take control of that chaotic committee meeting and bring order to the proceedings. He shares the story of a young man who had struggled for years with what we might today recognize as addiction and depression. This person described feeling constantly at war with himself until one evening, during a moment of desperate prayer, he experienced what he called a melting of the heart. Suddenly, all the conflicting voices in his head seemed to harmonize into a single, clear purpose. The transformation wasn't just emotional or spiritual, it was practical. His relationships improved, his work became meaningful, and destructive habits simply fell away without struggle. But here's what makes James such a nuanced thinker. He doesn't romanticize these experiences or claim they're always permanent. He acknowledges that some conversions are temporary, like a fever that breaks and then returns. Others are lasting but incomplete, solving some problems while creating new ones. And some are so profound and enduring that they become the organizing principle of an entire life. What strikes me as particularly relevant for our time is James's insight about the role of surrender in conversion. So often, he observes, these transformative moments come not through effort and striving, but through a kind of letting go. It's like someone who's been trying desperately to fall asleep, tossing and turning all night, only to finally drift off the moment they stop trying. There's something about releasing our grip on control that paradoxically allows real change to occur. As we wrap up this exploration of conversion, consider how James's insights might apply beyond strictly religious contexts. Whether we're talking about recovery from addiction, healing from trauma, finding our life's purpose, or simply becoming more authentic versions of ourselves, the patterns he identifies remain remarkably consistent. There's often a period of struggle and dissatisfaction, a moment of surrender or breakthrough, and then the hard work of integrating new insights into daily life. The beauty of James's approach is that he honors both the mystery and the practicality of human transformation. He doesn't try to reduce these profound experiences to mere brain chemistry, nor does he dismiss the very real psychological and social factors that contribute to them. Instead, he invites us to remain curious, compassionate, and open to the possibility that human beings have an almost unlimited capacity for change and growth, regardless of how stuck or hopeless they might feel in any given moment. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who just radiates a certain quality that's hard to put into words. Maybe it's your grandmother who somehow never seems to lose her temper, or that teacher who made you feel like you mattered even when you were struggling. There's something different about them, isn't there? A kind of luminous calm and almost otherworldly patience. William James called this quality saintliness, and in his 8th lecture, he takes us on a fascinating journey into what makes these remarkable individuals tick. Now, before you start thinking this is going to be all halos and stained glass windows, let me tell you something interesting. James wasn't interested in official saints with capital S. He was fascinated by what he called the saintly character that can emerge in anyone anywhere when they've had what he terms a genuine religious experience. Think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to operate from a completely different playbook when it comes to how they treat others? That's what we're talking about here. James identifies 4 core characteristics that show up again and again in these saintly individuals, and here's where it gets really interesting for us modern folks. The first is what he calls a feeling of being in a wider life than that of this world's selfish little interests. Imagine for a moment that you could step outside the endless cycle of worrying about your mortgage, your social media likes, your career advancement, and suddenly feel connected to something infinitely larger. These individuals seem to live with that expanded perspective as their default setting. They're not ignoring practical concerns, but they're operating from a place where those concerns don't dominate their entire emotional landscape. The second characteristic is even more striking, a sense of the friendly continuity of the ideal power with our own life. This is James's elegant way of describing people who seem to have an unshakable trust that the universe, despite all evidence to the contrary, is fundamentally on their side. Now, think about this for a moment. We live in a world where the news cycle alone could convince you that everything is falling apart. Yet these saintly individuals maintain what seems like an almost naive optimism. But James argues it's not naive at all. It's based on a direct, felt experience of being supported by something greater than themselves. Here's where James gets really practical. The third characteristic is an immense elation and freedom, as the outlines of the confining selfhood melt down. Have you ever watched someone who's completely lost in service to others? Maybe it's a nurse working a double shift who still has energy to comfort a frightened patient, or a teacher staying late to help a struggling student. There's something almost magical about how they seem to transcend their own limitations when they're focused on something beyond themselves. James suggests this isn't just admirable behavior. It's actually a glimpse into a fundamentally different way of being human. The fourth characteristic might surprise you. A shifting of the emotional center towards loving and harmonious affections, towards yes, yes, and away from no, where the claims of the non-ego are concerned. In our culture of boundaries and self-protection, this might sound almost dangerous, but James is talking about something much more sophisticated than being a pushover. These individuals have somehow rewired their default response to life from suspicion and defensiveness to curiosity and care. Now you might be thinking, this all sounds lovely, but what does it actually look like in practice? James provides us with some remarkable examples that feel surprisingly contemporary. He tells us about individuals who seem to operate with what we might now call emotional intelligence on steroids. They had an uncanny ability to see the best in people, even when those people couldn't see it in themselves. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just sentiment. It was practical and effective. Consider how this plays out in today's world. We're constantly hearing about toxic workplaces, political polarization, and social media drama. Yet every so often, we encounter someone who seems immune to all this negativity. They're not naive about it, they just don't let it stick to them. More importantly, their presence somehow elevates everyone around them. James would say these people are exhibiting saintly characteristics, and the remarkable thing is that these qualities seem to be contagious. But James, ever the psychologist, doesn't just celebrate saintliness. He also examines its potential pitfalls. He warns us about what he calls devout but stupid, individuals who mistake excessive self-mortification for holiness, or those whose otherworldliness becomes so extreme that they lose touch with practical reality. It's a crucial distinction because it helps us understand that true saintliness isn't about being ethereal or disconnected from the world. It's about being more fully present to it, but from a radically different perspective. Here's where James's insights become incredibly relevant for our time. In an era of anxiety, depression, and what psychologists now call compassion fatigue, the saintly character offers us a different model. These individuals seem to have discovered a way of engaging with life's difficulties that doesn't deplete them but actually energizes them. They've found what James calls the secret of a continuous life in the sacred. The practical wisdom here is profound. James suggests that the transformation from ordinary consciousness to saintly character isn't necessarily a dramatic, once-in-a-lifetime event. It can be a gradual shift in how we orient ourselves toward existence. The key is what he calls the surrender of the lower self to the higher self. In modern terms, we might think of this as the movement from ego-driven living to purpose-driven living. As we wrap up this exploration of saintliness, consider this. James isn't asking us to become perfect. He's showing us that there's a way of being human that's more expansive, more joyful, and ultimately more effective than the anxious, defensive stance most of us carry through life. The saintly character isn't about achieving some impossible standard of perfection. It's about discovering what becomes possible when we stop trying to protect our small selves and start living from our larger selves. And that, James suggests, is a possibility available to any of us willing to undergo the transformation that genuine religious experience makes possible. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who radiates an almost otherworldly kindness. Maybe it's that teacher who changed your life, or the neighbor who always seems to know exactly when you need help. There's something different about them, isn't there? They seem to operate by a different set of rules, guided by principles that most of us admire but struggle to live by. William James, in his 9th lecture on religious experience, tackles one of the most fascinating questions of human behavior: what happens when people actually try to live like saints? And more importantly, what does that mean for the rest of us? Now think about this for a moment. When we hear the word saint, what comes to mind? Perhaps images of haloed figures in stained glass windows, or maybe that slightly uncomfortable feeling that saintliness is somehow impractical in our modern world. James, ever the pragmatist, wasn't interested in theological debates about official sainthood. Instead, he wanted to examine what he called the saintly character and ask a deceptively simple question: does it actually work? Does saintly behavior make the world better, or does it just make saints feel good about themselves? James begins by acknowledging something we all secretly wonder about those exceptionally good people in our lives. Sometimes their goodness can feel almost irritating, can't it? There's that colleague who never speaks ill of anyone, even the office tyrant. Or that friend who genuinely seems incapable of holding a grudge. Part of us admires them, but another part wonders if they're just naive, if they haven't quite grasped how harsh the real world can be. James understood this tension perfectly. He recognized that saintly behavior often strikes us as both inspiring and slightly suspect. But here's where James's analysis becomes really interesting. He argues that we need to separate two different questions. First, there's the question of whether saintly people are effective in achieving their own spiritual goals. Second, there's the question of whether their behavior actually benefits society. These aren't the same thing at all, and confusing them leads to all sorts of muddled thinking about the value of religious experience. Consider the saint's characteristic of what James calls practical helpfulness. Think about Mother Teresa working in the slums of Calcutta, or closer to home. Think about those people who volunteer at homeless shelters week after week, year after year. Now a cynic might say, well, that's all very nice, but they're just treating symptoms. They're not solving the root causes of poverty or homelessness. And you know what? The cynic has a point. But James would ask us to think more carefully about what's really happening here. When someone consistently acts with radical compassion, something fascinating occurs. They don't just help the immediate recipients of their kindness. They create what we might call ripple effects of moral possibility. Have you ever noticed how being around genuinely kind people makes you want to be kinder yourself? It's as if their behavior gives you permission to access parts of your own character that you'd forgotten existed. James observed that saints function as living proof that certain ways of being are actually possible, not just theoretical ideals. Here's a story that illustrates this beautifully. James tells us about a Quaker woman who made it her practice to visit prisoners, not to preach to them or to try to convert them, but simply to sit with them and treat them as human beings worthy of respect. Now, you might think, what good could that possibly do? She's not changing the prison system or addressing the social conditions that lead to crime. But something remarkable happened. Guards began treating prisoners more humanely. Other visitors started coming. The entire atmosphere of the prison shifted, not because of policy changes or institutional reforms, but because one person consistently embodied a different way of seeing and treating other human beings. This brings us to one of James's most profound insights about saintly behavior. Saints don't primarily change the world through grand gestures or systematic reforms. They change it by expanding our sense of what's humanly possible. Think about someone like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, they achieved specific political goals, but their deeper impact was in demonstrating that it was possible to fight injustice without becoming unjust yourself, to respond to hatred with love without becoming a doormat. But James wasn't naive about the challenges of saintly behavior in a complex world. He recognized what he called the vice of saintliness, the ways that extreme virtue can sometimes become problematic. Have you ever encountered someone whose goodness felt somehow oppressive? Maybe they were so forgiving that they enabled bad behavior in others, or so non-judgmental that they failed to protect the vulnerable from harm. James understood that virtues taken to extremes can become vices, and that effective saintliness requires a kind of practical wisdom about when and how to apply spiritual principles. This is where James's analysis becomes especially relevant for our time. We live in an era of deep polarization, where people often seem to believe that you must choose between being morally principled and being effective in the world. James suggests a different possibility. He argues that the highest form of saintly behavior involves what we might call skillful compassion, the ability to remain guided by love and service, while also being shrewd about how to actually help people and improve conditions. Consider modern examples of this kind of skillful saintliness. Think about people working in social justice movements who combine deep spiritual commitment with sophisticated understanding of political strategy, or entrepreneurs who build companies guided by genuine concern for their employees and communities, while still being successful in competitive markets. These people embody James's vision of saintliness that's both spiritually authentic and practically effective. As we wrap up this exploration of saintly behavior and its value, James leaves us with a provocative thought. Maybe the question isn't whether we can all become saints. Most of us probably can't and shouldn't try to live at that level of intensity. But maybe the real question is whether we can create space in our lives and communities for saintly people to flourish and do their work. Can we learn to recognize and support those among us who seem called to live by different rules, who insist on treating everyone with dignity even when it's inconvenient, who persist in acts of service even when the results aren't immediately visible? In our next exploration, we'll delve deeper into the mystical experiences that often fuel such saintly dedication, examining what James discovered about the nature of mystical consciousness itself. Picture yourself sitting across from someone who's just had what they describe as the most profound experience of their entire life. Their eyes are bright, almost glowing, as they struggle to find words for something that seems to have touched the very core of their being. They keep saying things like, "You had to be there," or "I can't really explain it, but everything just made sense." This is exactly the kind of territory William James ventures into when he tackles mysticism in his 10th lecture. And honestly, it's some of the most fascinating ground he covers in the entire book. James begins by acknowledging something we've all probably noticed. There's something almost frustrating about trying to understand mystical experiences from the outside. It's like trying to describe the color blue to someone who's never seen color, or explaining what chocolate tastes like to someone who's never had it. But here's what makes James so brilliant as a psychologist and philosopher. Instead of dismissing these experiences as mere hallucinations or wishful thinking, he takes them seriously as genuine psychological phenomena that deserve careful study. Now, think about this for a moment. In our modern world, we're constantly bombarded with data, facts, and rational explanations for everything. We live in an age where if you can't measure it, graph it, or put it in a spreadsheet, many people assume it doesn't really matter. But James suggests that mystical experiences might actually be windows into aspects of reality that our normal, everyday consciousness simply can't access. It's not that these experiences are anti-rational, but rather that they operate in a realm beyond what rational thought alone can reach. James identifies 4 key characteristics that seem to define genuine mystical experiences, And when you hear them, you'll probably recognize echoes of things you've encountered in your own life or heard others describe. First, there's what he calls ineffability, the absolute impossibility of putting the experience into adequate words. Think about the last time you witnessed a breathtaking sunset or felt overwhelming love for someone. Remember how any attempt to describe it felt inadequate, like you were trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. That's ineffability, and mystics report this feeling magnified 1,000-fold. The second characteristic is what James terms the noetic quality, the sense that the experience carries profound knowledge or insight. It's not just a feeling, it's a knowing. The person doesn't just feel good or peaceful, they feel like they've been given access to fundamental truths about the nature of reality, consciousness, or their place in the universe. In our contemporary world, you might see echoes of this in those breakthrough moments during meditation, or when someone has a life-changing realization during therapy, or even in those rare instances when a scientific discovery feels less like logical deduction and more like revelation. James also notes that mystical experiences are typically transient. They don't last very long in clock time, though their impact can reverberate through a person's entire life. And finally, they tend to be passive, meaning the person feels more like a recipient than an active agent. It's something that happens to them rather than something they make happen, though certain practices might make someone more receptive to such experiences. What's particularly fascinating is how James examines mystical experiences across different cultures and religious traditions. He looks at Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, Islamic Sufis, Hindu practitioners, and even explores the mystical dimensions of more unconventional sources. He's not trying to prove that any particular religious tradition has cornered the market on truth, but rather showing how these profound experiences seem to emerge across human cultures in remarkably similar ways. Consider this modern parallel. Think about how people from completely different backgrounds, a Silicon Valley tech executive, a Tibetan monk, a Brazilian artist, might all describe remarkably similar experiences during meditation or other consciousness-altering practices. They use different vocabularies, different cultural frameworks, but the underlying experience often shares those same core characteristics James identified over a century ago. James also grapples with a question that's probably occurred to you. If these experiences feel so real and profound to the people having them, what should the rest of us make of them? Should we take them as literal revelations about the nature of reality, or should we understand them as interesting but ultimately subjective psychological phenomena? James takes what you might call a pragmatic approach. He suggests we should evaluate these experiences by their fruits, by how they affect the lives of those who have them. Here's where things get really interesting for our modern context. James notices that people who have genuine mystical experiences often become more compassionate, more at peace with themselves, less anxious about death, and more committed to ethical living. They don't typically become otherworldly or impractical. Instead, they often become more effective and caring in their daily lives. In today's world, where we're constantly seeking evidence-based approaches to mental health and well-being, this pragmatic focus on outcomes feels remarkably contemporary. Think about the growing interest in mindfulness meditation, psychedelic therapy, or even the simple practice of spending time in nature. While these might not always produce full-blown mystical experiences, they often generate what we might call mystical adjacent states, moments of expanded awareness, deep peace, or profound connection that share some family resemblance to the experiences James describes. James also addresses the skeptics directly, and his approach here is beautifully balanced. He doesn't insist that mystical experiences prove the existence of God or validate any particular religious doctrine, but he does argue that they represent a genuine aspect of human consciousness that deserves serious attention. They might be pointing toward aspects of reality that our normal waking consciousness, with its focus on practical survival and social coordination, simply isn't equipped to perceive. As we move forward in our exploration of religious experience, James's treatment of mysticism serves as a crucial bridge between the intensely personal, subjective realm of spiritual experience and the broader questions about human nature and our place in the cosmos that religion attempts to address. Whether you're someone who's had experiences you might call mystical, or someone who remains skeptical about such claims, James offers a framework for thinking about these phenomena that's both scientifically rigorous and deeply respectful of the profound impact they can have on human lives. Picture this. You're sitting across from William James himself, steam rising from your coffee cups, and he leans forward with that characteristic twinkle in his eye and says, "You know, my friend, we've spent all this time talking about religious experiences, but now I need to ask you something that might make your head spin a little. What happens when the philosophers get their hands on all these mystical moments and profound spiritual encounters?" This is exactly where James takes us in his 11th lecture, and honestly, it's one of those conversations that feels both ancient and startlingly modern. Think about it for a moment. We live in an age where everyone's got an opinion about everything, where every experience gets dissected, analyzed, and explained away. Sound familiar? Well, James was dealing with the exact same thing over a century ago, except instead of Twitter debates, he had philosophers in dusty university halls trying to make sense of people's deepest spiritual moments. James opens this discussion with what I think is one of his most brilliant observations. He essentially says, look, philosophy and religion are like two people trying to describe the same sunset. One person feels overwhelmed by the beauty and starts weeping, while the other pulls out a spectrometer to measure the wavelengths of light. Both are looking at the same phenomenon, but they're approaching it from completely different worlds. Now think about this in your own life. Have you ever had a moment that felt transcendent, maybe watching your child take their first steps, or standing in a cathedral, or even just witnessing an act of unexpected kindness, and then tried to explain it to someone who immediately wanted to analyze it to death? That tension James is exploring isn't just academic, it's deeply personal and utterly human. James introduces us to what he calls the intellectualist approach to religion. These are the folks who believe that religious truth can and should be arrived at through pure reasoning, like solving a mathematical equation. They construct elaborate logical proofs for God's existence. They build theological systems as precise as clockwork, and they genuinely believe that faith should be rational, defendable, and systematic. But here's where James gets really interesting. He tells us about these philosophical arguments, these so-called proofs of God's existence, and he does something unexpected. Instead of dismissing them outright, he treats them with respect while gently pointing out their limitations. It's like he's saying, look, I appreciate the effort, but you're trying to catch the ocean in a teacup. Take the ontological argument, for instance. This is the idea that God must exist because we can conceive of a perfect being, and existence is part of perfection. James walks us through this with the patience of a good teacher, but then he essentially says, this might work on paper, but has anyone ever actually been converted to faith by a syllogism? It's such a wonderfully human observation. When was the last time someone's life was transformed by a logical proof? The cosmological argument gets similar treatment. This is the first cause argument, the idea that everything needs a cause, so there must be a first cause, which we call God. James acknowledges the logical appeal but points out something crucial. Even if this argument works, it doesn't get you to the God of religious experience. It gets you to a cosmic watchmaker, not to the loving, personal presence that mystics and believers encounter. What makes James's approach so refreshing is that he's not trying to demolish these philosophical arguments. Instead, he's like that wise friend who listens to your elaborate plan and then gently asks, but will this actually make you happy? He recognizes that these intellectual constructions might satisfy our need for logical consistency, but they don't touch the deeper human hunger that drives religious seeking. This brings us to one of James's most profound insights in this lecture. He distinguishes between what he calls living and dead hypotheses. A living hypothesis is one that appeals to you as a real possibility, something that could actually influence how you live. A dead hypothesis is intellectually interesting but existentially irrelevant. Now, think about your own beliefs, religious or otherwise. Which ones actually shape how you wake up in the morning, how you treat other people, how you face difficulty? Those are your living hypotheses. James suggests that for most people, the elaborate philosophical proofs of God's existence are dead hypotheses. They might be logically sound, but they don't capture the lived reality of religious experience. It's the difference between reading about love in a psychology textbook and actually falling in love. Both might be true, but only one transforms your life. But James doesn't stop there. He introduces us to what might be his most important contribution to this whole discussion, the idea that religious experiences have their own kind of authority that doesn't depend on philosophical validation. Think about this for a moment. If you've ever had an experience that felt sacred, profound, or transformative, did you need a philosopher to tell you it was valid? Of course not. The experience carried its own weight, its own truth. This leads James to a fascinating conclusion about the relationship between philosophy and religion. Philosophy, he suggests, can't create religious faith, but it can do something equally important. It can remove intellectual obstacles that prevent people from taking religious experience seriously. It's like clearing debris from a path rather than building the path itself. In our contemporary world, this insight feels remarkably relevant. We're surrounded by voices telling us that any experience that can't be measured, quantified, or replicated in a laboratory isn't real or meaningful. James would gently push back on this, not by dismissing science or rationality, but by suggesting that human experience is richer and more complex than any single method of inquiry can capture. As we wrap up this exploration of James's philosophical lecture, we're left with a beautifully balanced perspective. Philosophy has its place in the religious landscape, not as the foundation of faith, but as a helpful companion that can clarify, organize, and defend the insights that emerge from direct religious experience. It's the difference between the map and the territory, both useful, but never to be confused with each other. This sets us up beautifully for James's final thoughts on religion, where he'll weave together all these threads into a vision of faith that's both intellectually honest and experientially rich, both personally meaningful and socially relevant. Picture this. You've just spent an entire evening with a brilliant friend who's been sharing the most fascinating stories about human nature, spirituality, and the mysteries of consciousness. As the night winds down and you're both nursing that last cup of coffee, your friend leans back and says, "You know what? Let me tie all of this together for you." That's exactly what William James does in his final lecture of The Varieties of Religious Experience. And honestly, it's one of the most satisfying conclusions you'll ever encounter in philosophical literature. James begins this wrap-up by acknowledging something we've all felt at some point, the sheer overwhelming complexity of human religious experience. Think about it for a moment. Over the course of these lectures, we've journeyed through the minds of mystics who claimed direct communion with the divine. We've met individuals whose entire lives were transformed by sudden spiritual awakenings, and we've explored the psychological landscapes of saints and sinners alike. It's like trying to map an ocean while standing on the shore with a small notebook. But here's where James's genius really shines. Instead of throwing up his hands and declaring the whole enterprise hopeless, he does something remarkably practical. He looks for patterns, for threads that weave through all these diverse experiences. It's like being a detective who's gathered evidence from dozens of seemingly unrelated cases, only to discover they all point to the same fundamental truths about human nature. The first major insight James offers is perhaps the most radical. Religious experiences, regardless of their theological packaging, share certain unmistakable characteristics. Whether we're talking about a Christian mystic in medieval Europe, a Buddhist monk in ancient India, or even a modern person who has what they might call a spiritual awakening, while hiking in nature, there are common elements. There's usually a sense of encountering something larger than oneself, a feeling of unity or connection that transcends ordinary consciousness, and often a profound sense of meaning or purpose that emerges from the experience. Now, think about this in terms of your own life. Have you ever had a moment where you felt connected to something bigger than yourself? Maybe it was while looking at a starry sky, or holding a newborn baby, or even during a particularly moving piece of music. James would say these experiences, however we choose to interpret them, tap into the same fundamental capacity for transcendence that characterizes religious experience throughout history. But James doesn't stop there. He makes an even bolder claim. These experiences have genuine authority for the people who have them. This might sound obvious, but it was actually quite revolutionary for his time. The academic establishment was largely dismissive of religious experience, treating it as either primitive superstition or psychological pathology. James argues that this misses the point entirely. When someone has a profound spiritual experience that transforms their life for the better, making them more compassionate, more at peace, more capable of love and service, we can't simply dismiss it as delusion. Think of it this way. Imagine your best friend comes to you and says they've had an experience that's completely changed their perspective on life. They're happier, more generous, more patient with others, and seem to have found a deep sense of purpose. Would you tell them their experience was meaningless just because you couldn't measure it in a laboratory? James suggests that the fruits of religious experience, the actual changes they produce in people's lives, are a form of evidence that deserves serious consideration. This leads to one of James's most practical insights. We should judge religious experiences by their outcomes, not by their theological explanations. It's like evaluating a medicine by whether it actually helps people get better, rather than by the theoretical framework used to explain how it works. If someone's spiritual practice makes them a better person, more ethical, more loving, more resilient in the face of life's challenges, then that practice has value regardless of whether we can fully understand or explain it. James also tackles something that many of us struggle with in our increasingly secular age, the relationship between science and spirituality. He doesn't see them as necessarily in conflict. Instead, he suggests that they operate in different domains of human experience. Science excels at understanding the material world, the realm of measurable phenomena and predictable patterns. But religious experience deals with questions of meaning, purpose, and value that science, by its very nature, cannot address. Consider this analogy. Imagine trying to understand a beautiful piece of music by analyzing only the physics of sound waves. You could measure frequencies, amplitudes, and wave patterns until you had volumes of data, but you'd still miss something essential about what makes the music meaningful to human beings. James suggests that religious experience occupies a similar space in human life, providing insights and meanings that complement rather than compete with scientific understanding. Perhaps most importantly for our modern world, James offers a vision of religious tolerance that feels remarkably contemporary. He argues that the diversity of religious experiences isn't a problem to be solved, but a feature of human nature to be celebrated. Different people, with different temperaments, backgrounds, and needs, will naturally be drawn to different forms of spiritual expression. The key is not to find the one correct religion, but to recognize the underlying human capacity for transcendence that expresses itself in countless ways. This insight feels particularly relevant today, doesn't it? In our globalized world, we're constantly encountering people from different spiritual traditions, or perhaps we find ourselves drawn to practices from various traditions. James would say this is perfectly natural and potentially enriching, as long as we remain open to learning from the genuine spiritual insights that emerge from authentic religious experience. As we close this remarkable journey through the landscape of human spiritual experience, James leaves us with a profound challenge. He suggests that the ultimate test of any religious or spiritual insight isn't whether it fits into our existing beliefs or scientific frameworks, but whether it helps us live more fully human lives. Can it help us face suffering with courage? Can it inspire us to treat others with greater compassion? Can it provide us with a sense of meaning and purpose that sustains us through life's inevitable challenges? These are the questions that matter, James suggests, and they're questions that each of us must answer for ourselves based on our own experience and reflection. In a world that often seems divided between rigid fundamentalism and dismissive materialism, William James offers us a third way, a path of open-minded exploration that takes both human experience and human reason seriously, recognizing that the deepest truths about life might emerge not from dogma or laboratory measurements alone, but from the careful, honest examination of what it means to be fully, authentically human. William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience is a profound exploration into the personal dimensions of faith and spirituality. The book dives deep into the diverse experiences of individuals and how these experiences shape their perception of the divine and the moral universe. The text transcends orthodox interpretations, presenting religion as a deeply personal and psychological phenomenon. Here are some key actionable takeaways from this transformative work. 1. Embrace the diversity of experience. Religion and spirituality manifest in myriad forms, and every individual's journey is unique. Embrace this diversity within yourself and others. Practically, you can start by engaging in conversations with people from different faith backgrounds. Listen actively and with an open heart. This practice not only broadens your understanding, but also fosters empathy and connection. 2. Cultivate personal introspection. James emphasizes the importance of introspection in religious experience. Begin with small, manageable moments of self-reflection, perhaps a few minutes each day. Use this time to explore your own beliefs, values, and experiences. Be patient with yourself as you dig deeper into understanding your spiritual self. 3. Value the pragmatic benefits. Religion often brings psychological benefits such as peace, purpose, and resilience. Focus on how your beliefs or spiritual practices enhance your life practically. Identify one belief or practice that brings you comfort or strength, and find ways to integrate it into your daily routine. 4. Allow for growth and change. James illustrates that religious experiences are not static, they evolve over time. Give yourself permission to grow and change spiritually. Reflect periodically on how your beliefs have developed and where they might lead you next. Start incredibly small by noting even the slightest shifts in your perspective. 5. Acknowledge the power of the unseen. Many religious experiences involve the unseen or the ineffable. Recognize the value of these experiences even if they defy rational explanation. Encourage yourself to appreciate the mystery, perhaps through meditative practices that focus on gratitude and wonder, allowing yourself to dwell in the unknown with curiosity rather than fear. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.